Thank you very much, Jan, for the invitation. I have to say that it's a wonderful pleasure to speak to a full room on this topic. It's not always that this happens. It's a pleasant surprise, but also beyond the full room, just a little bit about the intimacy of those of us who work on Vilna. Cecile and I were graduate students together when Nancy was an assistant professor. Jan also came up around the same time. I've known Hannah Pauline Galai, who will talk this afternoon, and to gather this one group of people in one space, sort of, and to be able to allow us to leave our normal lives and to come here is a real pleasure for a scholar. So thank you very much for facilitating this. My job today is to talk a little bit about, to link both the general topic of Vilna that Cecile was just talking about and also the specific focus on Avrom Sutzkever by focusing a little bit or talking a little bit about Sutzkever's memoir of the Vilna-Ghetto. But as a means of transition, and I go off-piste a little bit from my prepared notes, I have to say that it's worth remembering, since I'm also a scholar of Jung Vilna and have been working on a book on this topic for many, many years that hopefully will come out in the next short little bit, that in 1940, we have to remember this, 1940, when Warsaw is already under Nazi occupation, it's Sutzkever in the island that is Vilnius, who publishes one of the greatest collections of Yiddish modernist poetry to ever appear, the collection Waldigs, which is almost untranslatable as a title, Foresties, which to me is the closest example to secular poetic liturgy that we have in the Yiddish language. Really prayers to the ability to walk in the forests of what was then the Polish-Lithuanian countryside, to celebrate the Yiddish language, to talk about space as one's own. And I would be embarrassed to come and talk about the destruction of Vilna if I didn't also talk about what Sutzkever represented in his time and afterwards for the life of Vilna. For, if anything, Sutzkever's entire career, if you read him, is a statement about the life impulse of Judaism, of Jewish culture, and of the Yiddish language, and is in some ways resistant to the memorial impulse that he was also so invested in and that he also is so known for now. So a little bit of a transition now to the memoir. In the summer of 1944, in Moscow, Avrom Sutzkever, poet of Jung Vilna, cultural activist of the Vilna-Ghetto, partisan fighter, wrote what would be his only full-length non-fiction book, a prose account of the ghetto years simply called Vilna-Ghetto, from the Vilna-Ghetto, 1941 to 1944. 24 years earlier, another noted writer of Vilna, Lund, had published a work under the exact same title, following another world war. While Sutzkever would certainly have been aware of Lund's anthology of Gestalten und Bilder, part of a self-conscious, immediate post-World War I interwar movement to develop a myth of place to foster civic pride in the city's interplay of tradition and innovation, Sutzkever's work, consisting of dozens of short episodes, were of a very different sort, detailing the cultural, the spiritual, the material resilience, and the physical destruction of Vilna Jewry during its darkest hours. If Lund's Vilna-Ghetto was designed to provide a modern and living community with a bridge to its traditional past, Sutzkever's Vilna-Ghetto was a testimonial document designed to provide the city's refugees and the broader Yiddish-speaking world with a chronology of a catastrophic break in continuity. The memoir was published by Emis, an official organ of the Communist Party in Moscow, a year and a half later, around the same time that another edition, slightly different, appeared under the imprint of the Association of Vilna Natives in France. While Sutzkever was at work on the memoir, his real literary energies were devoted to editing his volume of wartime lyrics, which appeared around the same time under the title Die Festung, the Fortress, and drafts of what would eventually become his first epic poem, Geheimstadt, about a community of Jews hiding from the Nazis in the sewers of Vilna. Scholars of Sutzkever have paid scant attention to Vilna-Ghetto, despite his reputation as the most important Yiddish poet witness to the Churban and among the leading Yiddish literary figures of the post-war period of its regeneration, it has played no significant role in discussions of the author's oeuvre. One might even go so far to say is that Sutzkever himself erased his own memoir from memory, from public memory, through its purposeful neglect. Everything he had to say about the destruction of European Jewry was poured into his lyrics and into his symbolic prose, which he included in his collected works, in his meticulously edited Lieder von Yamamovis, in his late volume Die erste Nacht in Ghetto. The prose memoir was a wartime relic that he rarely mentioned. We are therefore faced with a paradox. On the one hand, one cannot doubt Sutzkever's deep investment, influence, and responsibility in developing a dual body of testimonial and aesthetic literature that would serve as a permanent matseva, a textual lieu de mémoire for Vilna Jewry. He devoted a significant amount of his time in the Vilna-Ghetto at great personal risk, both to developing his mythopoetics of resistance and destruction and to rescuing important documents and artifacts from the city's libraries. When he escaped from the ghetto just prior to its liquidation in September 1943 to join a partisan unit in the Navot forest, the literary imperative continued to claim him through his assignment as a group chronicler. And when, I know a little bit later today, we'll hear more about this, when his poem Kol Nidre was smuggled out of the ghetto by a partisan courier with the intended destination of Yiddish poet Peretz Markish. Markish shared it with Ilya Ehrenberg, who had it translated into Russian. And of course, the story goes when Sutzkever was alive and living in the forest, he was then rescued by the Jewish anti-fascist committee. Sutzkever's Moscow period from 1944 to 46 was productively feverish, as he attempted to negotiate his new role in response to two shifting landscapes. One as witness to the complete destruction of his home community, and as a partisan poet who was upheld as the face of Jewish heroism by a Soviet regime in which the future of Yiddish was by no means certain. Indeed, Sutzkever's Yiddishist, pre-war Yiddishist, and proto-Zionist sentiments necessitated that he navigate his new environment with great care, while capitalizing on the ways in which Moscow's Jewish intellectuals promoted his career. These years were also a critical moment in his public transformation and self-fashioning, from private poetic aesthete to voice of his community. There is no doubt that Sutzkever understood both the expectations and the limitations of writing in the Soviet Union. Not only had he been at the forefront of resisting pressure from local communists in the 1930s to bring a more socially engagé approach to his poetry, but he also believed strongly that the cultural distinctiveness and national dignity of the Jews as a people was yoked to Yiddish artistry. By contrast, the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee did not necessarily privilege Jewish nationality as its primary mode of identification. So one would assume then, this is the problem that I'm trying to set up, that the only memoir written by Avrom Sutzkever would figure pretty prominently in his oeuvre. How to explain its relative silence? Now, when I say relative, I mean it's been translated into Hebrew twice, once very recently, into German, into French. You're working on? No. So not in Swedish or Danish. But never into what we might call the international scholarly language. I hate to say that, but never into English. So when I approached several years ago a number of colleagues about my interest in publishing an English translation that would be annotated and thickly introduced of Sutzkever's memoir, I was greeted with unexpected skepticism and indeed some hostility. Especially from historians, but also from literary scholars. Two reactions figured prominently and are worthy of our consideration. First, colleagues suggested that the memoir was politically compromised due to its solicitation, its composition, and its publication in the Soviet Union. Was the memoir self-censored to please his rescuers or to protect his ability to function as a writer in the Soviet Union? As a young man in pre-war Vilna, of course, Sutzkever was known to have shunned the communists. And at a time when Yiddish poets were supposed to be somehow politically involved, Sutzkever had thrilled at his independence as an aesthete. To what extent could his Vilna-Ghetto, they asked, really be taken seriously as a reliable historical source, written under the watchful eyes of a censor, by a writer who might have been eager to please his rescuers and secure his new position in Moscow, not to mention to amplify his own poetic mythology? To what extent was it a composition of a fragile negotiation between the expectations and the political need of his patrons for a hero model on the one hand, and the thirst of a local refugee Yiddish readership for a witness to the destruction of their shared home community on the other? To what extent was the memoir an early example of the tension, now very familiar to all of us, between history, collective memory, and political imperative? Second, those who I talked with said that Sutzkever might have been compelled to take a detour into prose memoir in order to serve the expectations of the moment, even if it was not his literary priority, and despite the fact that he later insisted that everything that he had to say that was of any value could be found in his poetry. This would naturally lead to their second hesitation, that translating his memoir for a wider audience would somehow diminish his literary reputation. Did the memoir, they asked, not exist in tension and perhaps even undercut what he had so meticulously constructed in his poetic works? Here, skeptics were not so much concerned with facticity, that is, historical reliability of Sutzkever, as they were with literary worth. What seemed to nag my interlocutors was the memoir's seeming journalistic accounting of his experience, written in spare prose, somewhat breathlessly, in haste, right in the immediate aftermath before one could even process perhaps what one had seen. His poetry, they argued, communicates so much more experience. It is true that the accounts of life and death in the Vilna-Ghetto are conveyed in much more detail, both in Hermann Kruk's monumental Yiddish diary and in Zelig Kamenovich's Hebrew diary, both rescued in part by Sutzkever and others, and by Yitzchak Rudishevsky's teenage diary. Given the richness of these three other works, they ask, why translate Sutzkever at all? And to that I answer, why translate Isaac Babel's diaries of his travels in the 1920s when you could just read Red Cavalry? Why translate Kafka's letter to his father when everything that was about one can find in The Trial or in Metamorphosis? These are sort of questions that I think nag those of us who work at the intersections of literature and history. So to be concise, critics of the memoir dismissed it by claiming that it was spare, if not erroneous, in its historical knowledge, potentially compromised by its politics, self-serving, and, compared to the poet's talents as a writer, lacking artistically. And if you add on to all of that Sutzkever never himself promoted it or republished it in his lifetime, suggested to them that the writer had perhaps disassociated himself from it altogether. But are any of these claims actually accurate? So let's see how far we can get in the remaining time. Von Vilna-Ghetto is a memoir in 4 parts, covering a period of exactly 3 years. It moves chronologically, opening with the German attack on Soviet-controlled Vilnius as part of Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, and ending with the author's return to the city from Moscow immediately after its liberation in July 1944. Its first and its fourth, its last sections, Under the Heel of the Germans, which covers the initial Nazi occupation, and On Simmering Ashes, which gathers testimony from eyewitnesses, are roughly the same length. In that sense, the memoir corresponds neatly to a literary convention that scholars of Holocaust literature have long observed, that witnesses to the final solution tend to telescope in on the initial moments of occupation, that is the shock, and on the liberation, that is the realization, the reckoning perhaps, while telescoping out and then compressing time in the long period in between, that is ghettoization and mass murder. The opening and closing chapters, which are all subdivided into smaller episodes, bookend the 2 much longer middle sections. Behind the Gate, which concentrates on the internal organization and socio-cultural life of the Vilna-Ghetto, and the 3rd chapter, the United Partisans Organization, which focuses on resistance. In terms of space, then, the memoir privileges expressions of what we might call organizational, cultural, and physical resistance in an attempt to craft a heroic narrative of ghetto life as a balance against its chronicle of destruction. Since these models of communal endurance are bracketed by murder, by humiliation, and by annihilation, the memoir is haunted by an unreconcilable tension. The spiritual and physical resistance in which Sutzkever himself was so deeply invested had proved unable to save most of Vilna Jewry, including his infant child and mother. In one of the memoir's penultimate scenes, the tension is realized as he and his partisans dig up the treasures that they had buried in a ghetto hiding spot prior to the city's liquidation. Quote, "We came to one of the most important hiding places. We found posters of Goldfaden's theater performances, a box of letters by Sholem Aleichem, manuscripts by Bialik and Gorky and Mendele and Yehoyash. And in a corner we found sculptures, most rescued from the Ansky Museum. In the obscurity, we saw a bust of a head by Tolstoy by Ehrenberg, by Ilya Ginsberg. While digging out Antokolsky's statue of David, we suddenly saw an arm. My body froze. It was not a plaster arm. One of the Jews hiding in the city's Melina hiding spots had been buried next to this sculpture." End quote. So you see here the yoking together of the spiritual with the physical, that is the relief that their dangerous work had managed to preserve some of Vilna's sacred treasures, with the grotesque reminder of the ultimate fate of Vilna Jewry, resisted this mythologizing in prose. Personal and cultural survival was rendered minuscule in comparison to the fate of ordinary Jews. The memoir does not offer any overview of pre-war Vilna or its place in Jewish life, as Cecile just has done. Its role as a Yerushalayim Delite was of no particular interest, perhaps, to his Soviet sponsors. That the full and rich spectrum of Jewish institutional and educational and religious and cultural life that was Jewish Vilna was not discussed at all in the memoir, suggests that there were two competing expectations built into it. First, from a Soviet, or perhaps from a universalist standpoint, the guiding goal of the memoir was not about the destruction of Vilna as a Jewish city, necessarily. And the other competing interest, if I could find where I am in my paper, was between the memoir's Soviet sponsors and the desire among the city's refugee population and the broader Yiddish-speaking world for information, just raw data, about the fate of Yerushalayim Delita. The memoir could not, what I want to suggest, at this stage, unlike what his poetry perhaps could do a little bit later, it could not at this early stage evaluate what the destruction meant to the Jewish world in particular. Readers would have to do just with the descriptions of what had happened, and from them imply historical and cultural meaning. Sutzkever was also hypersensitive about finding the proper balance between personal and collective experience, between his own fate and that of the majority of his community. It may also be that he self-censored himself from commenting on his reception in the Soviet Union, or even thanking his Soviet sponsors for his rescue because of fear of political co-option. So what I'm suggesting is that the memoir should be appreciated in its context as a very early attempt at Holocaust memoir, a memorialization, at one of the earliest Yiddish examples of what we might call nowadays the collection and ingathering and synthesis of oral history, because there are many testimonies that are included in that fourth section. And the memoir becomes an early attempt to create a polyvocal Holocaust text. It's not so much Sutzkever's memoir of the ghetto as an attempt to forge a collective text of witnessing in recognition that the experience of any one individual, even if that one person was of the status of an Avrom Sutzkever, would be too limiting to communicate the scope of national trauma. Since the goals of memoir and the goals of testimony may or may not be synonymous, the first, assumedly, is meant to reflect personal experience, while the second, in a legal sense, is designed to serve the cause of justice. Sutzkever's memoir seems less interested in exposing the self than in functioning as an evidentiary document. Not unrelated to this, scholars have noted that the memoir carefully eschews judgment of Jewish actions, especially those of the Judenrat, given the proximity of the time to those events. There is very little there about the actions or decisions of the FPO. The section about the decision to give up Itzik Wittenberg to the Nazi authorities has become something that scholars have argued about whether Sutzkever actually got it right. Sutzkever's conflation of physical and cultural resistance and expression in the ghetto is also a question that has come up over and over and over again. But I want to suggest, and I'll conclude momentarily, that the memoir also serves as an early intervention, perhaps one that anticipates later debate, about the degree to which the cultural life of the ghetto distracted its inhabitants from the very real dangers that lay before them. Even Jews who chose to ignore Abba Kovner's call not to go like sheep to the slaughter are accorded honor, as are pages of testimony about non-Jews who risked their lives to save Sutzkever and his fellow townspeople. Categories of perpetrator, of rescuer, and of victim are neat and uncomplicated, and spiritual heroism is presented alongside partisan activity as providing dignity and the ability to maintain moral poise. Such episodes may be brief, but they are powerful, as is his account of seeing Professor Yud Gerstein, the director of the city's pre-war Yiddish choir, with a group of children singing poetry, or a dedication to one of the teachers. So a little bit more specifically, and then we can conclude. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the way the memoir constructs an early visual narrative of the Churban through its inclusion of photography. We must remember that in 1946, the world did not yet possess an iconic visual narrative of the Holocaust in the way that we might think of that in our imagination today. And I want to suggest that the photographs that he chose to include in the memoir serve both a narrative and an evidentiary function. So the PowerPoint that I presented was corrupted, and my administrator was able to send me not a PowerPoint, but a PDF of all of the images that appeared. I'm going to go through them very, very quickly in the nature of time, but just to give you the order. This is the exact order they appear in the Soviet volume. The photos in the volume include a picture of the poet himself holding a gun, meant to establish the yoking together of poet and fighter in one image. Orders posted on the ghetto walls. A photo of Yaakov Gens, the head of the ghetto, of the Judenrat. An image of Ghetto Yedias, the underground Jewish newspaper. An image of Sutzkever and his non-Jewish rescuer. Some trigger warnings here, these aren't straight. Pictures of Jewish bodies from Ponar and from Kluge. Pictures of war criminals, mass murderers. Jewish women as partisans. I'm not going to go through all of them. More bodies. More perpetrators. The bomb that was produced to derail German trains. An image of the plans for that. A statue by Shmuel Bach. A picture of Sutzkever and the artist Shmuel Bach. A picture of Itzik Wittenberg, the ghetto commander. A picture of the aftermath of the Vilna-Ghetto. The destruction of Jewish Vilna. Obviously, we're not going to go through all of these. The Soviet Red Army entering the city. A group of Jewish partisans after the war. Abba Kovner. And you'll notice here at the end, the last image, a statue of David in the middle by Antokolsky. And then more bodies. So if we were to say, what does this narrative, this photographic narrative, weave together for us? I would say that we might read these photographs as a type of story that he's trying to put together themselves. The first and the last image, you recall the picture of Sutzkever himself holding the gun, and the last image of King David, in a way are two examples of the Jewish poet-fighter from two different times and from two different Jerusalems. Then you have all of the evidentiary materials that I've just suggested appeared. Then you have the indivisibility of the physical resistance and the cultural resistance, the indivisibility of the Soviet struggle and the Jewish struggle, and also the particularity of Jewish experience by focusing on images, especially of the Schulhof. So we have here, if we just read the images, one could write a whole narrative of what they might be trying to communicate. The second question that I want to leave us with to conclude is to take up this issue of, isn't his poetry better? Right? This very simple sort of, there are Yiddish literary critics who say, what do we need to read his description in the memoir of Der Zirk, of the circus, which we heard read last night, when we have the circus, right? We have the poem, The Circus. Why read those descriptions? It's a total flattening of what his poetry represents. And I think that what I've concluded now is that I believe Sutzkever drafted the memoir not in the opposite direction, right? He wrote his poems or had poems in mind and then went back to draft the memoir around the poems, rather than having a memoir that then led to the ability to write poetry. Many of them had already been drafted in some way, not all, but many, even before the memoir had been written or solicited. So what we might say, and this is a little bit provocative, is that readers gain very little insight into the transformation of historical experience into Sutzkever's art. Right? You don't see how he takes raw material of experience and makes that into art, because you already have the art in some ways. Sutzkever's, rather, it's the opposite. You provide a window. You get to see what occurs when the symbolic meaning of art is deliberately stripped away and rendered into prose. In a way, you have two completely different narratives, two completely different ways of talking about this. So one example. The death of Sutzkever's infant son. In the memoir, the murder of Sutzkever's infant son is related into one single short paragraph. So you think, this is the memoir of the poet, traumatic event, you figured there might be a paragraph, 2, 3 pages, very, very short, 3 or 4 lines. Quote, I went to look for my mother. She was full of joy and told me that my wife had given birth. She was not thinking of Franz Müller and the law that condemned to death all children born in the ghetto. The next day, my child was no more executed according to the law. Period. That's it. So people looking for information on how he came to later write, or before write, Zum Kind, the poem to his son, will not find anything in the memoir. In fact, Zum Kind provides more information perhaps than the memoir actually will. And the explanation to this is sort of there, because the memoir was composed when he was very close to those events, unable to process perhaps what they meant in the same way that a poet is able to poeticize and mythologize what they want to communicate in terms of experience. The same thing we see in the poem read last night in the circus. You have 3, if my memory correct, Heather might be able to help me, but 3 or 4 part poem in the circus, but very little in the memoir is similar to the poem. The most famous part of the poem is the end, where the poet confronts himself and says, and how embarrassed and how ashamed I was that I was not able to stand up and have the courage to spit on those who tried to humiliate me and told me to strip and to dance around the Torah scrolls. And now I shall forever remain embarrassed by that. Nothing in the memoir that will describe that. So we are left, or the translator is left with a distinct problem with this memoir. On the one hand, my belief is that whenever you have a world writer, someone who's a status of a world writer, when there are things that are published and when there are archival materials that aren't published, you try to disseminate and translate as much as you can, because the more that's out there, the more people can work. And then, on the other hand, you have the protective atmosphere of an establishment Yiddish literary world who wants to somehow protect the myth of Sutzkever and wants to make sure that that which is not up to the level or the same comes out into the eyes of the public. So I'm going ahead and forging ahead with this memoir. It will be contextualized, and some of these questions will appear. And I know that some of you will have questions and that we'll hear a little bit more about the Soviet period afterwards. So thank you.